If you told me just a few years ago that I would be producing shows for people like Esther Perel, Priya and brands like the New York Times, TED, the Gates Foundation, I would have told you that you are crazy, okay? But here we are. I am living proof that taking one small step in the direction of your dreams will really land you there or somewhere near that dream. And if you are someone who wants to start a podcast of your own, but you're just not sure you have what it takes, I promise you, you do. It's simpler than you think. Stick with me. Hey, I'm Hiwote. I'm a podcast producer, and this is a channel for aspiring podcasters who want to make a podcast as unique as they are. And if you want to learn more about the Emerging Voices Accelerator that I run for aspiring podcasters, make sure to click the link in the show notes. Here's how I really got into podcasting. The year is 2017. I am working at a social policy research firm. I'm an analyst there. I had just graduated from Johns Hopkins, where I studied public policy and health finance, and I thought that my career was gonna be on that path. Like, I was gonna be a public policy analyst, okay? But the problem was that I really hated my job. And when I say I hated it, I don't mean I kind of didn't like it. I mean, I hated going to work every day, feeling like, oh, there's no way I can do this for the rest of my life. But at the same time, I felt like I can't not have a quote unquote serious job. So while I was working that job, I started experimenting with lots of different creative outlets. I was making cards on Etsy to sell. I was painting. I started a YouTube channel, which hadn't made it that far back then. And eventually I was like, you know what? The real problem I'm trying to solve for is that my life, not vibrant. Like, it does not feel fun. And I wanted to learn from people who had created vibrant lives for themselves. So I taught myself how to podcast using YouTube University and whatever I could find online and a $70 mic from Amazon. And I basically just started recording interviews with friends and friends of friends who I thought, like, hey, you seem to have some answers of how to live a life that is actually fulfilling and meaningful and impactful, and I'd love to interview you. Now, did I know anything about interviewing? Absolutely not. Did I know how to really edit? Absolutely not. Did I know how to distribute my podcast? Absolutely not. But I felt like, you know what? I can test this, and if it sucks, I don't have to keep doing it, but like, I can at least learn on the go. And that's exactly what I did. With every single episode, at that point, I was editing on GarageBand. I was learning how to interview by Googling, like, how does Terry Gross do good interviews? Like, I would learn one or two things, or how does Oprah interview people? I'd learn a couple things. And it was such a piecemeal experience, right? Where I was like, okay, I'm learning things here and there, until I decided, okay, I'm gonna invest a little bit of money. And I took a boot camp I was living in New York at the time, and I did this boot camp with Union Docs. And I felt like, okay, cool, like, this is how real producers record things. And I felt a bit discouraged, to be honest with you, after that boot camp, because I was like, this is a ton of work, and I don't know if I'm actually that well suited to be that good of a podcaster or a quote unquote audio reporter. I would say it wasn't until I decided that I didn't have to do it like anybody else. I could just not put pressure on this thing. I could learn how to tell stories in my own way. I could figure out what my own voice was when I was interviewing people, editing myself. Like, I just gave myself permission to not be perfect. The minute I did that, it felt like the whole world opened up, because when I did that, I allowed myself to think more creatively around what it would really take for me to get better and better at this, okay? And in my particular scenario, because I am someone who works really well with other people, so I knew that if I could work at a company that was already doing podcasts in a more systematic and systematized way, I would learn a ton and I could apply that to my own podcast. At this point, my podcast was relatively successful. Like, it was getting decent downloads. I want to say it was getting like maybe 500 or 600 downloads per episode, which is actually not bad. Most podcasts don't get that much. At that point, I also was feeling like I was building a community on Instagram, on a newsletter, and those people were really engaged in what I was creating, and they were telling me that the stuff I was creating was impacting their lives. So I knew the stuff I was making was impactful, but was it really the level of success that I really wanted? I wasn't quite getting at that point, okay? I'm getting rejected from all these jobs, and I decide, you know what? Maybe I give this up, and actually I just do something tangentially related to this. So I'm gonna go work in media. So I quit my job and I start working at a company called Afropunk, which is a music festival company, okay? And we were putting on live events. I was learning a ton about, they had a podcast that they were trying to grow, so I was helping with that. And in the meantime, I was still making my show. People were still engaging with it. And I decided that I would just make the best of whatever this phase of my life and my career was. One random day, I am leaving a book event, like a book signing that someone was doing in New York. And on the train, I happened to meet the producer of Where Should We Begin, okay? And we strike up a conversation. And as I'm talking to her, I'm like, wait, it would be crazy of me not to just ask her out to coffee. I didn't have an intention of asking her for a job. At that point, I'd kind of given up on the idea of getting a job as a podcast producer from someone else, because I felt like I'm just not qualified and I would need to like go to school or something in order to do that. Now this woman and we happened to hit it off. So when I asked her out to coffee, this is like on the train, mind you, okay? So when I asked her out to coffee, she's like, yeah, sure, I would love to. So a couple weeks later, we go out for coffee. You're not gonna believe this, but it just so happens to be my birthday weekend. And also, it just so happens that we share a birthday. So the two of us are like really vibing, we're really connecting. And at the end of that coffee, I wasn't asking her for a job, so I didn't have any like big ask of her. She was like, what? So how can I support you? And I was like, would you mind listening to an episode I've made and like giving me your notes? I would really appreciate that. And she was like, yeah, sure. She listens to the episode and she sends me a text and she's like, hey, I would actually love to hire you, and you can just work with us for 3 months, see if you like it, and it'll be like a little boot camp, and then you can go and make your own thing. And at the time, I was like, this can't be real. Like, this is not realistic, because before they had set up this company that was producing all these shows, they had been the head of Audible, the head of audio at Audible, and they had worked at NPR setting up these really incredible shows. So I just felt really lucky, okay? When I got to this job, when I tell you, I worked my butt off. Like, I was like, I will learn whatever needs to be learned. I will not ask for much, and I will use whatever resources I have to become the best producer that I can be. And I worked on Esther Perel's show as one of the first shows that I worked on with them, and I loved it. Like, it felt like the understanding the show came really naturally to me because I was already a listener. But then learning how to put a story together when making a show, for example, for TED, we made a show called Far Flung. Working on that show, learning how to put a story together was something that I learned for the first time in a professional setting. Learning how to edit like a producer, how to think like a producer when you're editing an episode was something I learned for the first time while I was on that job. And one of the first projects that I felt like I really owned was a show called Together Apart for the New York Times with a host whose name is Priya Parker. You might know her. She wrote a book called The Art of Gathering, okay? So Priya, myself, and the production team at this company that I was working at, the company's called Magnificent Noise, we worked together to make this show a reality. And I felt like I was fully in producer mode. Like, I was picking guests, I was really pushing my brain to think more like a storyteller and a creative rather than the analyst that I had been before. At the same time, behind the scenes, I don't think anyone else could see this, but in my mind, I was like, I'm an imposter. Like, these people don't know. I don't know what I'm doing, okay? The truth is that as long as you are learning and improving, nobody cares. Nobody cares, okay? So I didn't know that. I also was kind of committed to this idea that I had to like really prove my worth and prove my value, which to some extent I think is like actually helpful for you because it's like pushing you to do the best you can do. But also I learned during that time that you can't overwork, because if you work too much, you actually like kind of dull your creativity, and your creative mind needs rest. It needs time to breathe. It needs time for you to just explore so that you can actually think more creatively when you come to sit down and record an episode or edit an episode. So this was over the course of 4 years. And 2 years in, we made a show called This Is Dating, and it was listed as one of Time Magazine's best podcasts of 2022. It was featured in the New York Times and on NPR and the Financial Times and a whole bunch of other outlets. The show did really well. And on that show, I learned that I love producing, meaning like I love helping people take the idea that's in their head and bringing it to life. But then I also really like hosting. Like I like using my voice and helping tell a story like actually vocally. And that realization is when I was like, you know what? I think I'm a podcaster through and through. And let me tell you something, none of that would have happened if I hadn't taken the leap from my tiny apartment in Harlem with my idea that I wasn't sure was good enough, with my $70 mic that I was sure I would need to upgrade at some point. I just felt like if I don't take this first step, I'm not gonna know whether there's any possibility of me being successful in this vision that I have for myself. And I think in truth, part of what I was really seeking was to build the creative resilience needed in order to become the kind of person who could host the kinds of shows that I was listening to when I was dreaming about being a podcaster. That's why in 2023, I quit my job, I took a sabbatical, and I really thought about what it is that I could create to help aspiring podcasters make shows that are truly unique to them. And now, of course, I run Emerging Voices, which is an accelerator that does exactly that. It gives you a blueprint of exactly how to make your show. There's live lessons. There is a community of other podcasters, and we work together to help you create the show that only you could make. And if you are someone who's watching this because you have the desire to start a podcast of your own, but either you feel like, I don't know if I have what it takes, I don't know if my idea is good enough, I feel like the tech is overwhelming, I'm here to tell you, get comfortable starting messy. Let this thing that you have in your head, let it be bad until it's good, okay? You just need the reps in order to actually make your idea good. Because I think for most of us, this idea of perfectionism is actually what's holding us back so much from our dreams. If I hadn't talked to that woman on the train because I thought that my podcast was not good enough, I wouldn't have the job I have now. I never would have had the cool experiences I had. I never would have produced the shows I produced. It literally takes one moment where you say yes to yourself and your whole trajectory can completely change. So my question for you is, how can you allow yourself to say yes to yourself today? And if you're someone who's like, hey, I really don't know where to even begin with this, I'm gonna invite you to watch a free workshop that I recorded and is gonna be in the show notes below. It walks you through the 3 stages that I teach everybody: strategy, production, and community building, and how to think about these things, what tools to use, etc. Okay, it'll give you a foundational principle that'll help you get comfortable with the idea of sharing your idea with the world, because we really need your voice out there. So I promise you, you've got this. I will see you in the next video.